Welcome back to ERM Advantage. I'm Eric Holmquist. Now, as we're wrapping up this series on the enterprise risk assessment, in our last video, we started the conversation around the macro side of the assessment and how to think about preparing for that component. In this video, we're now going to look at the specific pieces of information we want to consider in the process of evaluating, assessing these risks. Now, I'm particularly excited about these next couple of videos because up until now, the assessments we were looking at, principally the operational, I've tried to bring some best practices in the process, and from the many wonderful emails I've gotten from all over the world, it sounds like this is helping many of you. But the assessment itself is still fairly familiar. As we now talk about this macro side, we're going to look at what I think is kind of a novel approach. It's not rocket science, but it's a structure that I have found to work very effectively in getting down to the root of some of these design macro level risks. So let's get into it. Now, once again, as we think about these macro level risks, a number of aspects are greatly simplified. For instance, the risk considerations are much simpler than with operational risks. Rather than having to consider this myriad of ways that a process can have different outcomes with different implications, here we're only really looking at strength of design. In short, is each conceptually designed effectively? Let's use an example, for instance. Take our information security program. Here, we're not asking, what if it's not done? Or what if people don't follow the program requirements? Those are operational questions. What we're asking here is the program designed correctly and optimally? If the program itself is badly designed, people's compliance with the program is irrelevant. You still won't achieve the intended results. Now, this design question has several implications, and notably so for a regulated entity. At minimum, a badly designed program will not perform as intended. But it could also be subject to regulatory criticism, which can certainly have its own implications, even before the program becomes operational. This is why it's so important to consider design separately. We're asking different types of questions, thinking differently about how risk is minimized, or more specifically, how it is aligned to our risk appetite level. This remains one of the most underrepresented aspects of most assessments for the reasons cited in the previous video, but in many ways is the most important area. And while many of these areas may be periodically reviewed or tested or have supporting analytics, the focus tends to be on how they are executed, but they don't get to the underlying assumptions or risk philosophy behind why something was built that way in the first place. Far too many times we see something go spectacularly wrong, and only on reflection do people ask, my Lord, why was it built that way? Now, there's a wide variety of ways that we could evaluate strength of design. Historical performance, independent reviews of something, benchmark studies, supporting analytics. These are all good. But we're not going to do those for every single key area of design, and we shouldn't have to. We should have a means of self-assessing. So go back to what I said in the very first risk assessment video. Always start from what you know that you know. So what do we know? We know the design of our strategies, programs, etc., and the relevant external influences. What do we think we know? The assumptions associated with the design. Essentially, the reason why things are built the way they're built. Remember, risk always lies in the assumptions. Why did we build it that way? Well, because we assumed that. Another reason why this is the best place to start is, once again, it puts the exercise in the language of the business, which has been our goal throughout, and in ways that are practical, tangible, and can be challenged by anyone. So that's going to be our starting point, a strong foundation on which we can build. So let's take a look at the template that we're going to be using to try and evaluate these types of risks. So this is the worksheet form that I've had great success with. Again, it certainly isn't rocket science, And the contents are very straightforward, but it's a very good way to organize this information and serve as a common assessment tool. Now, this version is a Word document, but you could create the same thing in Excel or into any popular GRC tool. The template uses one section for every key design area and has common sections for each. So let's walk through it. On top, we have the area we're evaluating, in this case, capital management, along with the description of the associated risk and potential impact. Once again, no need for a great deal of detail. All management members understand these risks. To the right, we have an area where we will ultimately come to our conclusions about risk levels. We'll get to those later. In the main area is where we'll capture our key assumptions, where we're going to spend a good deal of time. Below that, we have a section for capturing risk sources, similar to what we did with operational risks. The concept is the same. If something were to go wrong, likely from vulnerabilities based on various design flaws, where or how would those failures likely originate? To the right is where we'll consider the impact of this risk across our primary risk types. Once again, within this framework, we do not use risk types as primary risk dimensions. Rather, we continue to use them as lenses to better evaluate and understand risks. We'll come back to that. Then we have a section for noting related and supporting materials, and finally concluding comments about this design area. So let's work through this form as an example. First, our risk description, which obviously reflects the potential for a poorly designed macro area. Similar to operational risks, here we capture the nature of the failure and general thoughts on its implications. In this case, an inadequate capital plan and process, which may not ensure sufficient capital levels, both to ensure safety and soundness and to support the bank's strategic objectives. This is then followed by an impact statement where we can describe the potential impact to the institution based on the design failure. In this case, inadequate capital levels would, at minimum, restrict the bank's ability to support its ongoing strategy and, at worst, could put the bank out of compliance with regulatory requirements and threaten the overall safety and soundness of the bank. Collectively, the risk description and impact statement give us the basis for our inherent risk perspective. Again, similar to operational risks, it's what could go wrong and what would it mean. Now, for this particular risk, we're not going to spend a lot of time or effort describing it. This one, similar to things like liquidity management or credit administration, are very intuitive risks. Everyone understands them. However, there are other areas that can have more nuanced implications, and for those, it may be worth a more detailed description of failure scenarios and possible implications. Next are our key assumptions that we have associated with this design area, capital management. Now, this list is in no way exhaustive, but it's a good representative sample and it's an excellent list for us to start with. For each assumption, we have the assumption statement. In this case, the first one is capital targets are governed based on a defined risk appetite framework, which are agreed to and approved by management and the board. Now, it seems obvious that this would be the case, but not always. This one's pretty obvious, but in many cases it isn't. And so many problems arise due to unspoken assumptions where it turns out that management does not agree. The process of getting these down on paper and putting a stake in the sand about our collective confidence is the first step in truly understanding and managing these types of risk. Next, and this is simple enough, we have a confidence rating, represented here by these colored boxes. Now, this just simply represents a 5-point scale. You could do the same thing with rating values, low, medium, high, or a number 1 through 5. But in this case, I just find some value in representing the information visually, and we'll see why in a minute. So the way to think about these strength indicators is basically defined as 5 meaning highly confident, 4 confident, 3 mostly confident, 2 fairly unconfident, and 1 little to no confidence. Now, it's important to understand that sometimes people believe that nothing should ever be rated as the top end of any scale, that those are always aspirational. And that's not the case here. The 5 or the top value simply means highly confident. That's all. And there are many times with assumptions that will be the case. So it's very important to encourage people not to be hesitant to say highly confident whenever appropriate. If, however, you feel that people just don't think they can ever choose that value, you can also address this by adding a sixth value, which is certain or virtually certain. No one will ever choose that value, and so they would then be okay with selecting the second option of highly confident. But in the process of capturing management's view of the confidence level in these assumptions, some very interesting things are going to emerge. Now, in completing this exercise, we can do this in one of two ways. One, we can meet with the entire senior management team and ask for a collective view around each confidence level. While certainly the quickest and most efficient way to complete this exercise, it's also in many ways the least effective. This is because for many of these areas, there are almost always either unspoken or spoken differences of opinion about the strength of each. If we hold a workshop with the entire management team, the answers will always represent the loudest voice in the room. Dissenting voices may never be heard, and we would have lost one of the most important purposes of this exercise. Alternatively, we, typically meaning members of the risk management team, an outside consultant, or other independent body, can meet with the senior and executive management members and get this input individually. Again, recognizing that there's a certain inefficiency in this, it's really the only way we're likely to identify areas of mismatched views, particularly if we've developed an open and trusting relationship with these management members to where they feel they can be candid and direct with their concerns or contradictory views. However, one thing that is critical in this model is that they know their answers will be kept in confidence. Violate that confidence even one time and you're done. Now, assuming that we do gather this information from team members separately, in a bit later we'll talk about how we aggregate that information together. So, going back to our worksheet, in addition to our assumptions and the related confidence levels, there's also a column here for talking about the measurability of each assumption. In some cases, an assumption is purely qualitative, largely based on a subjective view. However, in other cases, an assumption may be related to a highly quantitative factor, one that could be easily measured and monitored. This is useful in that assumptions that are considered central to a risk perspective may be aligned with certain metrics and related limits and thresholds. We'll go much deeper on this in an upcoming video on reporting metrics. And finally, we leave space for any related comments that the participant would like to include. These could include notes where the participant feels the need for more information, has questions, or wants to note that things may be changing in ways that may cause them to reconsider their confidence level. Or these comments could be used just to support confidence levels that they believe are particularly high or low. Now, one quick note before we move on. While I always advise great caution when using weightings in any assessment, in this case, there may be some merit to the idea that certain assumptions are more meaningful than others. I have to grant that. So while not shown here, when we look at how we'll aggregate this information together, there is an opportunity then to apply weightings to the assumptions. We'll talk about that more later on. So let's walk through one example, assuming we're interviewing one particular executive. All right, let's walk through a live example. Say I was sitting with a member of senior executive management and we're going to go through these worksheets together. We would have talked through the list of key risks we're going to be talking about and the overall structure of this framework. And we would have visible this key that shows what each of the 5 levels mean and how to think about them. We're going to talk about capital planning, and obviously we described the risk and the impact. But again, we wouldn't spend time on that because that's just very familiar territory to anybody in management. Rather, we're going to spend time talking about these assumptions that really unpacks how we think about and manage capital and see what comes from that. And again, get their input on their confidence on each of these various assumptions. So starting at the top, capital management and targets are governed based on a defined risk appetite framework agreed to and approved by management and the board. I would say yes, it absolutely is subject to a risk appetite framework. I'm not so sure how deliberate those numbers are, I think sometimes they're kind of arbitrary, but I am confident that these are managed in line with a risk appetite framework. The capital plan is updated no less than annually and reviewed and approved by senior management and the board of directors. Absolutely no question, highly confident in that. The bank maintains and frequently updates its capital plan projections, which are visible, reported to senior management and the board of directors. 100%. This is something that is monitored constantly and regular reporting provided to ALCO and management and the board, no question. The bank has approved thresholds for capital below which certain management actions must be taken. These levels meet or exceed regulatory standards for sound capital management and align with the bank's related risk appetite. Again, highly confident. These are very clear, well-known, and they are acted upon when capital levels do approach or exceed certain thresholds. Capital levels are actively managed and monitored, and any changes or anticipated threats are escalated and addressed. I agree that there is a lot of monitoring. I'm not sure I'm as confident on whether we are aware of everything that's emerging that could threaten capital, but I am confident in that. All significant new strategic plans or initiatives are evaluated to determine the potential implication on capital levels or requirements. This one I'm not as comfortable with. We've got some new initiatives we've proposed that I think when we think about these, we tend to focus a lot on the possible benefit, but I don't know that we do enough analytics. So I would say I'm only fairly confident in that because I think we need to analyze some of these initiatives a little deeper to see if they could have losses that could impact capital levels. And I can make a note here. And again, that can be for our benefit, and as risk managers, we would keep those to ourselves, these observations. But it's good to note because if we start to see patterns from multiple people that have similar concerns, then this is where we might want to sort of raise the question, saying, look, there's a sense among management. But again, we always want to protect the individual responses from management members. The next one, individual major initiatives are generally not of a scale that could materially impact capital levels should they fail to succeed. I generally agree, but there are some more recent initiatives that could have some impact. So while I think that is generally true, I am concerned about some of these newer initiatives. So I would say mostly confident on that one. The bank's suite of product offerings are not by nature one that could lead to sudden or catastrophic losses, which would materially impact capital levels. Again, I'm mostly confident, but with the caveat that, again, some of the more recent initiatives I think could be riskier than we really realize. Should the need arise for capital at the bank level, the parent company is able to infuse additional capital. Absolutely, that is a high confidence in that one. And finally, the bank's capital plan, practices, and levels are considered acceptable by the bank's regulators and auditors. Absolutely, they've been fine with these, no concerns, so highly confident in those. So again, just to reiterate, this list is in no way exhaustive. There could be other factors that you may want to consider. The purpose here is just to give a representative sample of how to think about key assumptions that relate to certain areas of risk that give us an opportunity to think about what has been the collective thinking of the design of our approach to this area before you get down into the weeds of execution. And as we walk through these assumptions, and particularly as we aggregate the responses together, a picture will begin to appear based on the collective confidence levels, which starts to give us some perspective on the degree to which our design has mitigated this risk, but not based on arbitrary risk ratings, but in the language of the business. Now, before moving on, I just want to expand a little bit on why I believe this approach works and why identifying and evaluating these assumptions is so critical. First, these assumptions get us to the root of our design. Why is our approach designed this way? What is our intended outcome? More often than not, the why of something is more important than the how. And if there's a flaw in the design, it's almost always found in the why. Second, as I've said and has been a priority all along, it puts this in the language of the business. People struggle with abstract high, medium, low designations, but statements written in simple English that speaks to our intended business practices are approachable by everybody. then our job as risk practitioners is to help translate those statements into risk factors. Third, we can connect these back to our risk appetite framework. If we go back to our worksheet from the video on risk appetite, for capital, we considered a number of related risk factors, establishing both a target risk level and an estimation of current levels. Now, if you wanted, you could mirror similar assumption statements into the risk appetite worksheets, which would certainly support the appropriate appetite levels defined. However, this can get messy, and that there isn't always a one-to-one correlation between the risk appetite factors and program assumptions. One factor could relate to multiple assumptions and vice versa, but that is certainly an option if you want. Fourth, these assumptions can be challenged, evidenced, tested, and in most cases, monitored. They give us a remarkably strong foundation to build on, and we are going to build on them, trust me. But more importantly, they support meaningful discussion. And finally, they help us flesh out and reconcile differing views in a non-personal, non-accusatory way. So many times I've seen instances where one dominant voice has established a policy or program or standard or approach, and while alternate, even dissenting views may exist and have truly legitimate concerns, they don't feel that they have a voice because to question the policy or standard could be seen as a personal attack or questioning the subject matter expert's knowledge. This is unfortunate because no organization can truly run in a healthy way where voices are not allowed to be heard. So, we need a constructive, impersonal, objective way to put things on the table for all the room to see and discuss and simply ask, is this the best way? Does this line up with our strategy, our risk appetite, our short and long-term goals? By looking at these assumptions objectively, it creates a space for honest discussion, largely taking the person out of the equation. Now, as I said, too often when risks of all kinds are assessed, it starts with the execution. But if the approach is flawed to begin with, then execution may not matter. Moving on to risk sources, in the same way that we considered sources on the operational risks, we want to give some thought as to the how of our assumptions could become suspect, either because we were wrong, didn't follow the program, or because something significant changes. And as with the sources associated with operational risks, just because something could go wrong doesn't mean that it has or will, just that it could. Considering these may cause us to revisit certain assumptions, or think about additional monitoring mechanisms, or even reconsider additional mitigation efforts. In this case, factors that could undermine the assumptions associated with this risk might include a lack of a consensus on target capital levels, failing to monitor capital levels, significant or sustained losses, changes to required minimum capital levels, inability to access capital markets, a significant economic downturn. Again, the best way to think about risk sources is to be willing to honestly consider in what way could we be wrong, or could have things dramatically change that would now make one or more of our assumptions suspect. Then, moving over, we want to give some thought to how the risk relates to our primary risk types. By doing this, again, we have an opportunity to look at the risk through these lenses, which sometimes brings some additional perspective. A risk scenario often starts out as principally one kind of risk, but as you think about the repercussions and reverberations of it, very often moves you into other types of risk. For instance, a sudden capital shortfall starts as a strategic risk, but very quickly could become a liquidity risk with potential limitations on liquidity sources, a regulatory risk, certainly a reputation risk, and so on. You add these together and you start to get a true appreciation for the full scope and nature of each risk. Now, in all fairness, some risk types are more obvious than others, but there are some risks where the ripple effects are not always immediately obvious. And looking at them through these various lenses can often be eye-opening part of the exercise. For a first pass, it can be fine to simply estimate the impact across various risk types. And as you go along, you can factor those specific aspects into your deeper analysis, stress tests, etc., and then subsequently fine-tuning these scores. Once again, scores are good, but the main purpose of looking through these lenses is to give management the opportunity to more fully understand the broader implications of this type of failure, and where necessary, give consideration as to whether each aspect of risk has been sufficiently mitigated. Now, as with confidence level, we represent the degree of each risk visually on a 1 to 5 scale using boxes. Again, I just find this makes the information easily able to digest, since it takes no mental effort to translate this visual into a rating. But again, you could just as easily use a word or a score instead. Regardless of how you represent each score, just make sure that how you rate each risk aligns with how these values are defined in the framework overall. Low, medium, and high have to mean the same thing regardless of which assessment you're focusing on. And as we'll see when we aggregate this information together, collecting information about different types of risk from various parts of the assessment is giving us a much richer understanding of where each type of risk exists versus trying to stuff risks into individual unique risk buckets. Next, thinking about supporting materials. This is where we start to build and expand on this analysis, mapping in any and all of the other related elements that help us defend, document, or analyze this particular risk. We know that these are critical components of evaluating this area of risk, but the analysis is so much stronger when we started from the underlying assumptions and then moving on to the other materials. In addition, this is where we can point our various stakeholders, risk management, internal audit, our regulators, etc., to any and all documentation and analytics that supports our risk conclusions. Alternatively, the lack of related materials, meaning assumptions are largely based on a simple opinion or perception, should call into question the basis for any assumption confidence. In this case, there are some obvious elements that relate to capital planning and management, including a detailed annual capital plan, periodic capital analysis and projections, periodic stress tests, ongoing reporting to the board and senior management committees, ALCO, etc. So even as we think about these related elements, some of the assumptions reviewed could have an effect on them. Now, the last section is where management will ultimately put their concluding comments relative to this particular design area, but we're going to hold off on that for now until after we've gotten through the aggregation of information and the risk rating conclusions. Now, in addition to the worksheet shown here, I also use one for subsequent iterations, which includes a second set of confidence scores, here shown in gray, to represent the participant's answer given the last time this exercise was conducted, if only for reference. Okay, this is a good place to take a pause. I'm trying to keep these videos to a manageable length. In our next video, we'll go into detail on how we aggregate all this information together and put together our resulting graphs and charts, risk scores, and ultimate conclusions. Don't worry, that's not far behind. It's already being edited right now. So as always, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button if you haven't, and the notification bell so you'll be notified when new videos are available. Thank you.